The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Preface. The date at which the following events are assumed to have occurred may be set down as between 1840 and 1850, when the old watering place herein called Budmouth still retained sufficient afterglow from its Georgian gaiety and prestige to lend it an absorbing attractiveness to the romantic and imaginative soul of a lonely dweller inland, under the general name of Egdon Heath, which has been given to the sombre scene of the story, are united or typified heaths of various real names, to the number of at least a dozen, these being virtually one in character and aspect, though their original unity, or partial unity, is now somewhat disguised by intrusive strips and slices brought under the plough with varying degrees of success, or planted to woodland. It is pleasant to dream that some spot in the extensive tract whose southwestern quarter is here described, may be the heath of the traditionary King of Wessex, Lear. July, 1895. To sorrow I bade good morrow, and thought to leave her far away behind, but cheerly, cheerly, she loves me dearly, she is so constant to me, and so kind. I would deceive her, and so leave her, but she is so constant and so kind. Book ONETHE 3 Women 1. A face on which time makes but little impression. A Saturday afternoon in November was approaching the time of twilight, and the vast tract of unenclosed wild known as Egdon Heath embrowned itself moment by moment. Overhead the hollow stretch of whitish cloud shutting out the sky was as a tent which had the whole heath for its floor, the heaven being spread with this pallid screen and the earth with the darkest vegetation. Their meeting line at the horizon was clearly marked. In such contrast the heath wore the appearance of an instalment of night which had taken up its place before its astronomical hour was come. Darkness had to a great extent arrived herein, while day stood distinct in the sky. Looking upwards, a furze cutter would have been inclined to continue work. Looking down, he would have decided to finish his faggot and go home. The distant rims of the world and of the firmament seemed to be a division in time no less than a division in matter. The face of the heath by its mere complexion added half an hour to evening. It could in like manner retard the dawn, sadden noon, anticipate the frowning of storms scarcely generated, and intensify the opacity of a moonless midnight to a cause of shaking and dread. In fact, precisely at this transitional point of its nightly roll into darkness the great and particular glory of the Egdon waste began, and nobody could be said to understand the heath who had not been there at such a time. It could best be felt when it could not clearly be seen, its complete effect and explanation lying in this and the succeeding hours before the next dawn. Then, and only then, did it tell its true tale. The spot was, indeed, a near relation of night, and when night showed itself an apparent tendency to gravitate together could be perceived in its shades and the scene. The sombre stretch of rounds and hollows seemed to rise and meet the evening gloom in pure sympathy, the heath exhaling darkness as rapidly as the heavens precipitated it, and so the obscurity in the air and the obscurity in the land closed together in a black fraternization towards which each advanced halfway. The place became full of a watchful intentness now, for when other things sank blooding to sleep the heath appeared slowly to awake and listen. Every night its titanic form seemed to await something, but it had waited thus, unmoved, during so many centuries, through the crises of so many things, that it could only be imagined to await one last crisis, the final overthrow. It was a spot which returned upon the memory of those who loved it with an aspect of peculiar and kindly congruity. Smiling champaigns of flowers and fruit hardly do this, for they are permanently harmonious only with an existence of better reputation as to its issues than the present. Twilight combined with the scenery of Egdon Heath to evolve a thing majestic without severity, impressive without showiness, emphatic in its admonitions, grand in its simplicity. The qualifications which frequently invest the facade of a prison with far more dignity than is found in the facade of a palace double its size lent to this heath a sublimity in which spots renowned for beauty of the accepted kind are utterly wanting. Fair prospects wed happily with fair times, but alas, if times be not fair, men have oftener suffered from the mockery of a place too smiling for their reason than from the oppression of surroundings oversidly tinged. Haggard Egdon appealed to a subtler and scarcer instinct, to a more recently learnt emotion, than that which responds to the sort of beauty called charming and fair. Indeed, it is a question if the exclusive reign of this orthodox beauty is not approaching its last quarter. The new Vale of Tempe may be a gaunt waste in Thua, Human souls may find themselves in closer and closer harmony with external things, wearing a somberness distasteful to a race when it was young. The time seems near, if it has not actually arrived, when the chastened sublimity of a moor, a sea, or a mountain will be all of nature that is absolutely in keeping with the moods of the more thinking among mankind. And ultimately, to the commonest tourist, spots like Iceland may become what the vineyards and myrtle gardens of South Europe are to him now, and Heidelberg and Baden be passed unheeded as he hastens from the Alps to the sand dunes of Scheveningen. The most thoroughgoing ascetic could feel that he had a natural right to wonder on Egdon. He was keeping within the line of legitimate indulgence when he laid himself open to influences such as these. Colours and beauties so far subdued were, at least, the birthright of all. Only in summer days of highest feather did its mood touch the level of gaiety. Intensity was more usually reached by way of the solemn than by way of the brilliant, and such a sort of intensity was often arrived at during winter darkness, tempests, and mists. Then Egdon was aroused to reciprocity, for the storm was its lover, and the wind its friend. Then it became the home of strange phantoms, and it was found to be the hitherto unrecognised original of those wild regions of obscurity which are vaguely felt to be compassing us about in midnight dreams of flight and disaster, and are never thought of after the dream till revived by scenes like this. It was at present a place perfectly accordant with man's nature, neither ghastly, hateful, nor ugly, neither commonplace, unmeaning, nor tame, but, like man, slighted and enduring, and withal singularly colossal and mysterious in its swarthy monotony. As with some persons who have long lived apart, solitude seemed to look out of its countenance. It had a lonely face, suggesting tragical possibilities. This obscure, obsolete, superseded country figures in Domesday. Its condition is recorded therein as that of a furzy, briery wilderness, area. Then follows the length and breadth in leagues, and, though some uncertainty exists as to the exact extent of this ancient lineal measure, it appears from the figures that the area of Egdon down to the present day has but little diminished. Turbera area, the right of cutting heath turf, occurs in charters relating to the district. Overgrown with heath and moss, says Leland of the same dark sweep of country. Here at least were intelligible facts regarding landscape, far-reaching proofs productive of genuine satisfaction. The untamable, Ishmaelitish thing that Egdon now was it always had been. Civilization was its enemy, and ever since the beginning of vegetation its soil had worn the same antique brown dress, the natural and invariable garment of the particular formation. In its venerable one coat lay a certain vein of satire on human vanity in clothes. A person on a heath in raiment of modern cut and colours has more or less an anomalous look. We seem to want the oldest and simplest human clothing where the clothing of the earth is so primitive. To recline on a stump of thorn in the central valley of Egdon, between afternoon and night, as now, where the eye could reach nothing of the world outside the summits and shoulders of Helland which filled the whole circumference of its glance, and to know that everything around and underneath had been from prehistoric times as unaltered as the stars overhead, gave ballast to the mind adrift on change, and harassed by the irrepressible new. The great inviolate place had an ancient permanence which the sea cannot claim. Who can say of a particular sea that it is old? Distilled by the sun, kneaded by the moon, it is renewed in a year, in a day, or in an hour. The sea changed, the fields changed, the rivers, the villages, and the people changed, yet Egdon remained. Those surfaces were neither so steep as to be destructible by weather, nor so flat as to be the victims of floods and deposits, with the exception of an aged highway, and a still more aged barrow presently to be referred to. Themselves almost crystallized their natural products by long continuance. Even the trifling irregularities were not caused by pickaxe, plough, or spade, but remained as the very finger touches of the last geological change. The above-mentioned highway traversed the lower levels of the heath, from one horizon to another. In many portions of its course it overlaid an old vicinal way, which branched from the great western road of the Romans, the Via Iconiana, or Iconiled Street, hard by. On the evening under consideration it would have been noticed that, though the gloom had increased sufficiently to confuse the minor features of the heath, the white surface of the road remained almost as clear as ever. 2. Humanity appears upon the scene. Hand in hand with trouble along the road walked an old man. He was white-headed as a mountain, bowed in the shoulders, and faded in general aspect. He wore a glazed hat, an ancient boat cloak, and shoes, his brass buttons bearing an anchor upon their face. In his hand was a silver-headed walking stick, which he used as a veritable third leg, perseveringly dotting the ground with its point at every few inches interval. One would have said that he had been, in his day, a naval officer of some sort or other. Before him stretched the long, laborious road, dry, empty, and white. It was quite open to the heath on each side, and bisected that vast dark surface like the parting line on a head of black hair, diminishing and bending away on the furthest horizon. The old man frequently stretched his eyes ahead to gaze over the track that he had yet to traverse. At length he discerned, a long distance in front of him, a moving spot, which appeared to be a vehicle, and it proved to be going the same way as that in which he himself was journeying. It was the single atom of life that the scene contained, and it only served to render the general loneliness more evident. Its rate of advance was slow, and the old man gained upon it sensibly. When he drew nearer he perceived it to be a spring fan, ordinary in shape, but singular in colour, this being a lurid red. The driver walked beside it, and, like his fan, he was completely red. One dye of the tincture covered his clothes, the cap upon his head, his boots, his face, and his hands. He was not temporarily overlaid with the colour, it permeated him. The old man knew the meaning of this. The traveller with the cart was a reddleman, a person whose vocation it was to supply farmers with redding for their sheep. He was one of a class rapidly becoming extinct in Wessex, filling at present in the rural world the place which, during the last century, the dodo occupied in the world of animals. He is a curious, interesting, and nearly perished link between obsolete forms of life and those which generally prevail. The decayed officer, by degrees, came up alongside his fellow wayfarer, and wished him good evening. The reddleman turned his head, and replied in sad and occupied tones. He was young, and his face, if not exactly handsome, approached so near to handsome that nobody would have contradicted an assertion that it really was so in its natural colour. His eye, which glared so strangely through his stain, was in itself attractive, keen as that of a bird of prey, and blue as autumn mist. He had neither whisker nor moustache, which allowed the soft curves of the lower part of his face to be apparent. His lips were thin, and though, as it seemed, compressed by thought, there was a pleasant twitch at their corners now and then. He was clothed throughout in a tight-fitting suit of corduroy, excellent in quality, not much worn, and well chosen for its purpose, but deprived of its original colour by his trade. It showed to advantage the good shape of his figure. A certain well-to-do air about the man suggested that he was not poor for his degree. The natural query of an observer would have been, why should such a promising being as this have hidden his prepossessing exterior by adopting that singular occupation? After replying to the old man's greeting he showed no inclination to continue in talk, although they still walked side by side, for the elder traveller seemed to desire company. There were no sounds but that of the booming wind upon the stretch of tawny herbage around them, the crackling wheels, the tread of the men, and the footsteps of the two shaggy ponies which drew the van. They were small, hardy animals, of a breed between Galloway and Exmoor, and were known as heath croppers here. Now, as they thus pursued their way, the reddleman occasionally left his companion's side, and, stepping behind the van, looked into its interior through a small window. The look was always anxious. He would then return to the old man, who made another remark about the state of the country and so on, to which the reddleman again abstractedly replied, and then again they would lapse into silence. The silence conveyed to neither any sense of awkwardness. In these lonely places wayfarers, after a first greeting, frequently plod on for miles without speech. Contiguity amounts to a tacit conversation where, otherwise than in cities, such contiguity can be put an end to on the merest inclination, and where not to put an end to it is intercourse in itself. Possibly these two might not have spoken again till their parting, had it not been for the reddleman's visits to his van. When he returned from his fifth time of looking in, the old man said, "You have something inside there besides your load." "Yes." "Somebody who wants looking after." "Yes." Not long after this a faint cry sounded from the interior. The reddleman hastened to the back, looked in, and came away again. You have a child there, my man. No, sir, I have a woman. The deuce you have. Why did she cry out? Oh, she has fallen asleep, and not being used to travelling, she's uneasy, and keeps dreaming. A young woman. Yes, a young woman. That would have interested me 40 years ago. Perhaps she's your wife. My wife, said the other bitterly. She's above mating with such as I. But there's no reason why I should tell you about that. That's true. And there's no reason why you should not. What harm can I do to you or to her? The Riddleman looked in the old man's face. Well, sir, he said at last, I knew her before today, though perhaps it would have been better if I had not. But she's nothing to me, and I am nothing to her, and she wouldn't have been in my van if any better carriage had been there to take her. Where, may I ask? At Anglebury. I know the town well. What was she doing there? Oh, not much to gossip about. However, she's tired to death now, and not at all well, and that's what makes her so restless. She dropped off into a nap about an hour ago, and 'twill do her good. A nice-looking girl, no doubt. You would say so. The other traveller turned his eyes with interest towards the van window, and, without withdrawing them, said, I presume I might look in upon her. No, said the Riddleman abruptly. It is getting too dark for you to see much of her, and, more than that, I have no right to allow you. Thank God she sleeps so well. I hope she won't wake till she's home. Who is she? One of the neighbourhood. 'Tis no matter who, excuse me. It is not that girl of Bloomsend, who has been talked about more or less lately. If so, I know her, and I can guess what has happened. 'Tis no matter. Now, sir, I'm sorry to say that we shall soon have to part company. My ponies are tired, and I have further to go, and I am going to rest them under this bank for an hour. The elder traveller nodded his head indifferently, and the Riddleman turned his horses and van in upon the turf, saying, Good night. The old man replied, and proceeded on his way as before. The Riddleman watched his form as it diminished to a speck on the road and became absorbed in the thickening films of night. He then took some hay from a truss which was slung up under the van, and, throwing a portion of it in front of the horses, made a pad of the rest, which he laid on the ground beside his vehicle. Upon this he sat down, leaning his back against the wheel. From the interior a low soft breathing came to his ear. It appeared to satisfy him, and he musingly surveyed the scene, as if considering the next step that he should take. To do things musingly, and by small degrees, seemed, indeed, to be a duty in the Igden valleys at this transitional hour, for there was that in the condition of the heath itself which resembled protracted and halting dubiousness. It was the quality of the repose appertaining to the scene. This was not the repose of actual stagnation, but the apparent repose of incredible slowness. A condition of healthy life so nearly resembling the torpor of death is a noticeable thing of its sort. To exhibit the inertness of the desert, and at the same time to be exercising powers akin to those of the meadow, and even of the forest, awakened in those who thought of it the attentiveness usually engendered by understatement and reserve. The scene before the Riddleman's eyes was a gradual series of ascents from the level of the road backward into the heart of the heath. It embraced hillocks, pits, ridges, acclivities, one behind the other, till all was finished by a high hill cutting against the still light sky. The travellers' eye hovered about these things for a time, and finally settled upon one noteworthy object up there. It was a barrow. This bossy projection of earth above its natural level occupied the loftiest ground of the loneliest height that the heath contained. Although from the vale it appeared but as a wart on an Atlantean brow, its actual bulk was great. It formed the pole and axis of this heathery world. As the resting man looked at the barrow he became aware that its summit, hitherto the highest object in the whole prospect round, was surmounted by something higher. It rose from the semi-globular mound like a spike from a helmet. The first instinct of an imaginative stranger might have been to suppose it the person of one of the celts who built the barrow. So far had all of modern date withdrawn from the scene. It seemed a sort of last man among them, musing for a moment before dropping into the eternal night with the rest of his race. There the form stood, motionless as the hill beneath. Above the plain rose the hill, above the hill rose the barrow, and above the barrow rose the figure. Above the figure was nothing that could be mapped elsewhere than on a celestial globe. Such a perfect, delicate, and necessary finish did the figure give to the dark pile of hills that it seemed to be the only obvious justification of their outline. Without it, there was the dome; without the lantern, with it the architectural demands of the mass were satisfied. The scene was strangely homogeneous, in that the vale, the upland, the barrow, and the figure above it amounted only to unity. Looking at this or that member of the group was not observing a complete thing, but a fraction of a thing. The form was so much like an organic part of the entire motionless structure that to see it move would have impressed the mind as a strange phenomenon. Immobility being the chief characteristic of that whole which the person formed portion of, the discontinuance of immobility in any quarter suggested confusion. Yet that is what happened. The figure perceptibly gave up its fixity, shifted a step or two, and turned round. As if alarmed, it descended on the right side of the barrow, with the glade of a water drop down a bud, and then vanished. The movement had been sufficient to show more clearly the characteristics of the figure, and that it was a woman's. The reason of her sudden displacement now appeared. With her dropping out of sight on the right side, a newcomer, bearing a burden, protruded into the sky on the left side, ascended the tumulus, and deposited the burden on the top. A second followed, then a third, a fourth, a fifth, and ultimately the whole barrow was peopled with burdened figures. The only intelligible meaning in this sky-backed pantomime of silhouettes was that the woman had no relation to the forms who had taken her place, was sedulously avoiding these, and had come thither for another object than theirs. The imagination of the observer clung by preference to the vanished, solitary figure, as to something more interesting, more important, more likely to have a history worth knowing than these newcomers, and unconsciously regarded them as intruders. But they remained, and established themselves, and the lonely person who hitherto had been queen of the solitude did not at present seem likely to return. 3. The custom of the country had a looker-on been posted in the immediate vicinity of the barrow, he would have learned that these persons were boys and men of the neighbouring hamlets. Each, as he ascended the barrow, had been heavily laden with furze faggots, carried upon the shoulder by means of a long stake sharpened at each end for impelling them easily, to in front and to behind. They came from a part of the heath a quarter of a mile to the rear, where furze almost exclusively prevailed as a product. Every individual was so involved in furze by his method of carrying the faggots that he appeared like a bush on legs till he had thrown them down. The party had marched in drill, like a travelling flock of sheep, that is to say, the strongest first, the weak and young behind. The loads were all laid together, and a pyramid of furze 30 feet in circumference now occupied the crown of the tumulus, which was known as Rain Barrow for many miles round. Some made themselves busy with matches, and in selecting the driest tufts of furze, others in loosening the bramble bonds which held the faggots together. Others, again, while this was in progress, lifted their eyes and swept the vast expanse of country commanded by their position, now lying nearly obliterated by shade. In the valleys of the heath nothing save its own wild face was visible at any time of day, but this spot commanded a horizon enclosing a tract of far extent, and in many cases lying beyond the heath country. None of its features could be seen now, but the whole made itself felt as a vague stretch of remoteness. While the men and lads were building the pile, a change took place in the mass of shade which denoted the distant landscape. Red suns and tufts of fire one by one began to arise, flecking the whole country round. They were the bonfires of other parishes and hamlets that were engaged in the same sort of commemoration. Some were distant, and stood in a dense atmosphere, so that bundles of pale straw-like beams radiated around them in the shape of a fan. Some were large and near, glowing scarlet red from the shade, like winds in a black hide. Some were maids, with winny faces and blown hair. These tinctured the silent bosom of the clouds above them and lit up their ephemeral caves, which seemed thenceforth to become scalding cauldrons. Perhaps as many as 30 bonfires could be counted within the whole bounds of the district, and as the hour may be told on a clock face when the figures themselves are invisible, so did the men recognize the locality of each fire by its angle and direction, though nothing of the scenery could be viewed. The first tall flame from Rain Barrow sprang into the sky, attracting all eyes that had been fixed on the distant conflagrations back to their own attempt in the same kind. The cheerful blaze streaked the inner surface of the human circle, now increased by other stragglers, male and female, with its own gold livery. and even overlaid the dark turf around with a lively luminousness, which softened off into obscurity where the barrow rounded downwards out of sight. It showed the barrow to be the segment of a globe, as perfect as on the day when it was thrown up, even the little ditch remaining from which the earth was dug. Not a plough had ever disturbed a grain of that stubborn soil. In the heath's barrenness to the farmer lay its fertility to the historian. There had been no obliteration, because there had been no tending. It seemed as if the bonfire makers were standing in some radiant upper story of the world, detached from and independent of the dark stretches below. The heath down there was now a vast abyss, and no longer a continuation of what they stood on, for their eyes, adapted to the blaze, could see nothing of the deeps beyond its influence. Occasionally, it is true, a more vigorous flare than usual from their faggots sent darting lights like aides de camp down the inclines to some distant bush, pool, or patch of white sand, kindling these to replies of the same colour, till all was lost in darkness again. Then the whole black phenomenon beneath represented limbo as viewed from the brink by the sublime Florentine in his vision, and the muttered articulations of the wind in the hollows were as complaints and petitions from the souls of mighty earth suspended therein. It was as if these men and boys had suddenly dived into past ages, and fetched there from an hour indeed which had before been familiar with this spot. The ashes of the original British power which blazed from its summit lay fresh and undisturbed in the barrow beneath their tread. The flames from funeral piles long ago kindled there had shone down upon the lands as these were shining now. Festival fires to Thor and Woden had followed on the same ground and duly had their day. Indeed, it is pretty well known that such blazes as this the Heathmen were now enjoying are rather the lineal descendants from jumbled druidical rites and Saxon ceremonies than the invention of popular feeling about gunpowder plot. Moreover, to light a fire is the instinctive and resistant act of man when, at their winter ingress, the curfews sounded throughout nature. It indicates a spontaneous, Promethean rebelliousness against the fate that this recurrent season shall bring foul times, cold darkness, misery and death. Black chaos comes, and the fettered gods of the earth say, "Let there be light." The brilliant lights and sooty shades which struggled upon the skin and clothes of the persons standing round caused their lineaments and general contours to be drawn with durest vigour and dash. Yet the permanent moral expression of each face it was impossible to discover, for as the nimble flames towered, nodded, and swooped through the surrounding air, the blots of shade and flakes of light upon the countenances of the group changed shape and position endlessly. All was unstable, quivering as leaves, evanescent as lightning. Shadowy eye sockets, deep as those of a death's head, suddenly turned into pits of lustre. A lantern jaw was cavernous, then it was shining. Wrinkles were emphasized to ravines, or obliterated entirely by a changed ray. Nostrils were dark wells, sinews in old necks were gilt mouldings. Things with no particular polish on them were glazed. Bright objects, such as the tip of a furze hook one of the men carried, were as glass, eyeballs glowed like little lanterns. Those whom nature had depicted as merely quaint became grotesque. The grotesque became preternatural, for all was in extremity. Hence it may be that the face of an old man, who had like others been called to the heights by the rising flames, was not really the mere nose and chin that it appeared to be, but an appreciable quantity of human countenance. He stood complacently sunning himself in the heat. With a speaker, or stake, he tossed the outlying scraps of fuel into the conflagration, looking at the midst of the pile, occasionally lifting his eyes to measure the height of the flame, or to follow the great sparks which rose with it and sailed away into darkness. The beaming sight, and the penetrating warmth, seemed to breed in him a cumulative cheerfulness, which soon amounted to delight. With his stick in his hand he began to jig a private minuet, a bunch of copper seals shining and swinging like a pendulum from under his waistcoat. He also began to sing, in the voice of Ibi flew, the king, cat down, his nobles all, by one, by two, by three. Earl Mar shall, I'll go shrive the queen, and thou shalt wend with me. A boon, quoth Earl Marshal, and fell on his bend, Didn't that whatsoe'er the queen shall say, no harm thereof may be. Want of breath prevented a continuance of the song, and the breakdown attracted the attention of a firm-standing man of middle age, who kept each corner of his crescent-shaped mouth rigorously drawn back into his cheek, as if to do away with any suspicion of mirthfulness which might erroneously have attached to him. "A fair stave, Grandfer Cantle, but I am afraid 'tis too much for the mouldy wisdom of such a old man as you," he said to the wrinkled reveller. "Dossn't wish to waste 3 sixes again, Grandfer, as you was when you first learnt to sing it." "Hey," said Grandfer Cantle, stopping in his dance. "Dossn't wish waste young again, I say. There's a hole in thy poor bellows nowadays seemingly. But there's good art in me. If I couldn't make a little wind go a long ways I should seem no younger than the most aged man, should I, Timothy? And how about the new married folks down there at the Quiet Women Inn?" the other inquired, pointing towards a dim light in the direction of the distant highway, but considerably apart from where the Riddleman was at that moment resting. "What's the rights of the matter about You ought to know, being an understanding man. But a little rakish, hey? I own to it. Master Cantle is that, or he's nothing. Yet 'tis a gay fault, neither fair way, that age will cure. I heard that they were coming home tonight. By this time they must have come. What besides? The next thing is for us to go and wish joy, I suppose. Well, no. Now, I thought I must, or 'twould be very unlike me, the first in every spree that's going. Do thou put on a free ours coat, and I'll put on an other, and we will to Queen Eleanor go, like Friar and his brother. I met Mrs. Yeabright, the young bride's aunt, last night, and she told me that her son Clem was coming home Christmas. Wonderful clever, I believe. I should like to have all that's under that young man's hair. Well, then, I spoke to her in my well-known merry way, and she said, oh, that what's shaped so venerable she talked like a fool. That's what she said to me. I don't care for her, be joned if I do, and so I told her. Be joned if I care for I said. I had her there, hey? I rather think she had you, said Fairway. No, said Grandfer Cantle, his countenance slightly flagging. 'Tisn't so bad as that with me. Seemingly it is. However, is it because of the wedding that Clem is coming home Christmas to make a new arrangement because his mother is now left in the house alone? Yes, that's it. But, Timothy, hearken to me, said the Grandfer earnestly. Though known as such a joker, I be an understanding man if you catch me serious, and I am serious now. I can tell you lots about the married couple. Yes, this morning at 6 o'clock they went up the country to do the job, and neither Vil nor Mark have been seen of since, though I reckon that this afternoon has brought home again, man and woman, wife, that is. Isn't it spoke like a man, Timothy, and wasn't Mrs. Yeabright wrong about me? Yes, it will do. I didn't know the two had walked together since last fall, when her aunt forbade the banns. How long has this new set to been in mangling then? Do you know, Humphrey? Yes, how long? Said Grandfer Cantle smartly, likewise turning to Humphrey. I ask the question. Ever since her aunt altered her mind, and said she might have the man after all, replied Humphrey, without removing his eyes from the fire. He was a somewhat solemn young fellow, and carried the hook and leather gloves of a furs cutter, his legs, by reason of that occupation, being sheathed in bulging leggings as stiff as the Philistines' greaves of brass. That's why they went away to be married, I count. You see, after kicking up such a nunny watch and forbidding the banns, 'twould have made Mrs. Yeabright seem foolish like to have a banging wedding in the same parish all as if she'd never gainsaid it. Exactly, seem foolish like. And that's very bad for the poor things that be so, though I only guess as much, to be sure, said Grandfer Cantle, still strenuously preserving a sensible bearing and mien. Well, I was at church that day, said Fairway, which was a very curious thing to happen. If 'twasn't my name's simple, said the Grandfer emphatically. I han't been there to year, and now the winter is a-coming on I won't say I shall. I han't been these 3 years, said Humphrey, for I'm so dead sleepy of a Sunday, and 'tis so terrible far to get there, and when you do get there, 'tis such a mortal poor chance that you'll be chose for up above, when so many bain't, that I bide at home and don't go at all. I not only happened to be there, said Fairway, with a fresh collection of emphasis, but I was sitting in the same pew as Mrs. Yeabright, and though you may not see it as such, it fairly made my blood run cold to hear her. Yes, it is a curious thing, but it made my blood run cold, for I was close at her elbow. The speaker looked round upon the bystanders, now drawing closer to hear him, with his lips gathered tighter than ever in the rigorousness of his descriptive moderation. "'Tis a serious job to have things happen to 'ee there," said a woman behind. "Ye are to declare it," was the parson's words. Fairway continued, and then up stood a woman at my side, a touching of me. "Well, be damned if there isn't Mrs. Yeabright to standing up," I said to myself. Yes, neighbours, though I was in the temple of prayer, that's what I said. 'Tis against my conscience to curse and swear in company, and I hope any woman here will overlook it. Still, what I did say, and 'twould be a lie if I didn't own it. So, to it, neighbour Fairway. "Be damned if there isn't Mrs. Yeabright to standing up," I said, the narrator repeated, giving out the bad word with the same passionless severity of face as before, which proved how entirely necessity and not gusto had to do with the iteration. And the next thing I heard was, "I forbid the banns," from her. "I'll speak to you after the service," said the parson, in quite a homely way. Yes, turning all at once into a common man no holier than you. Ah, her face was pale. Maybe you can call to mind that monument in Witherberry Church, the cross-legged soldier that have had his arm knocked away by the school children. Well, he would about have matched that woman's face, when she said, "I forbid the banns." The audience cleared their throats and tossed a few stalks into the fire, not because these deeds were urgent, but to give themselves time to weigh the moral of the story. I'm sure when I heard they'd been forbid I felt as glad as if anybody had gave me sixpence, said an earnest voice. That of Ollie Dowden, a woman who lived by making heath brooms, or besoms. Her nature was to be civil to enemies as well as to friends, and grateful to all the world for letting her remain alive. "And now the mate have married him just the same," said Humphrey. After that Mrs. Yeabright came round and was quite agreeable. Fairway resumed, with an unheeding air, to show that his words were no appendage to Humphrey's, but the result of independent reflection. "Supposing they were ashamed, I don't see why they shouldn't have done it here right," said a widespread woman whose stays creaked like shoes whenever she stooped or turned. "'Tis well to call the neighbours together and to hae a good racket once now and then, and it may as well be when there's a wedding as at tide times. I don't care for closeways." "Ah, now, you'd hardly believe it, but I don't care for gay weddings," said Timothy Fairway, his eyes again travelling round. "I hardly blame Thomas and Yeabright and neighbour Wildeve for doing it quiet, if I must own it. A wedding at home means 5 and 6-handed reels by the hour, and they do a man's legs no good when he's over 40. True. Once at the women's house you can hardly say nay to being one in a jig, knowing all the time that you be expected to make yourself worth your victuals. You be bound to dance at Christmas because 'tis the time o' year. You must dance at weddings because 'tis the time o' life. At christenings folk will even smuggle in a reel or two, if 'tis no further on than the first or second chiel. And this is not naming the songs you've got to sing. For my part I like a good hearty funeral as well as anything. You've as splendid victuals and drink as at other parties, and even better. And it don't wear your legs to stumps in talking over a poor fellow's ways as it do to stand up in hornpipes. 9 folks out of 10 would own 'twas going too far to dance then, I suppose," suggested Grandfer Cantle. "'Tis the only sort of party a staid man can feel safe at after the muck have been round a few times." "Well, I can't understand a quiet ladylike little body like Tamsin Yeabright caring to be married in such a mean way," said Susan Nunsick, the white woman, who preferred the original subject. "'Tis worse than the poorest do. And I shouldn't have cared about the man, though some may say he's good-looking. To give him his due, he's a clever, learned fellow in his way, almost as clever as Clem Yeabright used to be. He was brought up to better things than keeping the quiet woman. An engineer, that's what the man was, as we know, but he threw away his chance, and so I took a public house to live. His learning was no use to him at all." "Very often the case," said Ollie, the besom maker. "And yet how people do strive after it and get it. The class of folk that couldn't use to make a round o' to save their bones from the pit can write their names now without a sputter of the pen, oftentimes without a single blot. What do I say? Why, almost without a desk to lean their stomachs and elbows upon. True, 'tis amazing what a polish the world have been brought to, said Humphrey. Why, afore I went a soldier in the bang-up locals, as we was called, in the year 4, chimed in Grandfer Cantle brightly, I didn't know no more what the world was like than the commonest man among ye. And now, Joan it all, I won't say what I bain't fit for. Hey, could sign the book. No doubt, said Fairway, if we's young enough to join hands with the women again, like Wild even Mrs. Thompson, which is more than Humph there could do, for he follows his father in learning. Ah, Humph, well I can mind when I was married how I said thy father's marks tearing me in the face as I went to put down my name. He and your mother were the couple married just afore we were, and there stood thy father's cross with arms stretched out like a great banging scarecrow. What a terrible black cross that was, thy father's very likeness in. To save my soul I couldn't help laughing when I said in, though all the time I was as hot as dog days, what with the marrying, and what with the women a-hanging to me, and what with Jack Changley and a lot more chaps grinning at me through church window. But the next moment a straw mote would have knocked me down, for I called to mind that if thy father and mother had high words once, they'd been at it 20 times since they'd been man and wife, and I said myself as the next poor stumble to get into the same mess. Ah, well, what a day 'twas. Wild Eve is older than Tamsin Yebright by a good few summers. A pretty maid too she is. A young woman with a home must be a fool to tear her smock for a man like that. The speaker, a peat or turf cutter, who had newly joined the group, carried across his shoulder the singular heart-shaped spade of large dimensions used in that species of labour, and its well-whetted edge gleamed like a silver bow in the beams of the fire. 100 maidens would have had him if he'd asked. Said the wide woman. Didst ever know a man, neighbour, that no woman at all would marry? Inquired Humphrey. I never did, said the turf cutter. Nor I, said another. Nor I, said Grandfer Cantle. Well, now, I did once, said Timothy Fairway, adding more firmness to one of his legs,